For decades, there has been one untouchable symbol of American performance, the car no one was supposed to challenge, the benchmark that defined what a true American sports car was allowed to be. The Chevrolet Corvette didn't just dominate showrooms, it dominated identity. It was protected by legacy, by loyalty, and quietly by the industry itself. And yet, for a brief and deeply uncomfortable moment, that dominance was threatened. Not by a foreign supercar, not by a boutique startup, but by Dodge. Inside Chrysler, engineers built something that wasn't supposed to exist. A car powerful enough, fast enough, and focused enough to expose a problem no one wanted to admit. The Corvette was no longer untouchable. This wasn't a wild concept sketch or an unrealistic prototype. It was real, it ran, and it was close. Too close. Because if Chrysler had allowed it to reach its full potential, it wouldn't have just competed with the Corvette, it could have rewritten the hierarchy of American performance entirely. That's when the project stopped moving forward. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. And the real question isn't what Dodge built, it's why Chrysler decided the world should never see it win. In the late 20th century, American performance was entering a rare moment of uncertainty. Fuel fears had faded, horsepower was climbing again, and buyers wanted more than heritage badges and nostalgia. They wanted proof. The Chevrolet Corvette had survived every storm, but its dominance was no longer unquestioned. Imports were faster, muscle cars were returning, technology was reshaping expectations. For the first time in years, the crown felt reachable. Dodge sensed it. While others played safe, Dodge leaned into aggression. Loud styling, big numbers, unapologetic attitude. The brand wasn't chasing refinement, it was chasing relevance. And American buyers noticed. This was an era when risks were rewarded, when manufacturers still believed shock value could move metal, when a bold performance statement could redefine a brand overnight. Dodge wasn't guessing. The audience was already primed. Sales data, enthusiast magazines, and street-level hype all pointed to the same conclusion. America was ready for a new hero. Not a foreign icon, not a luxury experiment, a domestic machine willing to cross lines. Inside Chrysler, that realization created a crossroads. They could protect the existing order, or they could disrupt it completely. Because when the market is begging for change, standing still becomes a decision. And at that moment, everything was aligned. Which makes what happened next far harder to explain. And that silence would soon speak louder than any press release ever could. Inside Dodge, this project wasn't treated like a publicity stunt. It was handled quietly by a small, performance-focused group that understood the assignment wasn't to impress journalists, but to solve a problem. They weren't chasing headlines, they were chasing numbers. The result was a machine engineered with intent, not compromise. Power delivery was aggressive. Chassis tuning prioritized real-world dominance. Weight, balance, and drivability were treated as weapons, not afterthoughts. On paper and in testing, it didn't just match the Chevrolet Corvette. In critical scenarios, it threatened to beat it. That's what made it dangerous. General Motors built the Corvette as a flagship. It had to represent refinement, image, and continuity. Dodge approached this car like a challenge. It didn't need to carry history, it only needed to win, and it could. This wasn't about peak speed or magazine benchmarks. It was about how effortlessly the car delivered performance, how easily it embarrassed expectations. Engineers quickly realized the problem wasn't capability, it was optics. Because if this car reached the public unchanged, it wouldn't just outperform the Corvette. It would expose uncomfortable questions about hierarchy, investment, and identity across the industry. Inside Chrysler, the threat became internal. Not external competition, but what this success implied. A Dodge beating America's sports car didn't destabilize GM alone. It destabilized the rules everyone quietly followed. The car was simply too effective, too honest, too revealing. And once leadership understood that success itself carried consequences, progress slowed. Because winning wasn't the risk anymore. What winning represented was. When the project reached its most promising phase, something inside Chrysler shifted. Test results were strong, internal confidence was growing, and the original mission had technically been achieved. That was precisely when leadership hesitated. Meetings changed tone. Questions stopped being about speed and durability and started focusing on positioning. Where would this car sit? Who would it upset? And what would happen if a Dodge publicly outperformed the Chevrolet Corvette? The concern wasn't engineering, it was fallout. Brand overlap threatened internal balance. A Dodge Halo car, powerful enough to dominate America's sports icon, risked collapsing carefully maintained hierarchies across Detroit. Victory suddenly looked reckless. There was also politics. The American performance market had unwritten rules. Competition was encouraged, humiliation was not. Letting this car loose would have sent a message that Chrysler wasn't interested in coexistence. It wanted dominance. That message carried consequences. Supplier relationships, media narratives, and long-standing rivalries would all shift overnight. And Chrysler leadership wasn't convinced the reward justified the disruption. So the language changed. Aggressive targets softened, timelines stretched, resources quietly redirected. No cancellation memo, no dramatic announcement, just a slow removal of momentum. This was the exact moment the project died. Not in a boardroom argument or public failure, but in restraint. In the decision to protect balance instead of chasing victory. Because once leadership chose caution, the outcome was locked. The car would never reach its final form, and the most dangerous Dodge ever conceived became something far safer. A possibility, and nothing more. A decision that would quietly reshape American performance history without ever appearing in a showroom or being publicly acknowledged afterwards. Nothing about the end of the project looked like a failure. There was no press release, no cancellation headline, no dramatic explanation. Inside Chrysler, the program simply stopped advancing. Budgets were reassigned. Timelines dissolved. Engineers moved on. What had once been urgent quietly became irrelevant. To the public, nothing ever happened. Dodge never positioned the car against the Chevrolet Corvette, never invited comparison, never allowed speculation to grow. Official messaging focused elsewhere, highlighting safer performance wins and production-friendly successes that wouldn't provoke controversy or embarrassment. Internally, the decision was understood. This wasn't a car that lost its way. It was a car that went too far. Performance wasn't the problem. Capability wasn't the issue. The problem was what the car implied if it existed without restriction. So Dodge redirected its energy. Power was repackaged. Aggression was softened. Lessons were absorbed and redistributed across other programs that wouldn't disrupt the balance of American performance. The dangerous parts of the project lived on, just never together. And over time, the threat disappeared. Not because it failed, but because remembering it served no purpose. Acknowledging it would raise uncomfortable questions about restraint, fear, and unspoken agreements inside the industry. The car became a rumor, a footnote, a what-if whispered among engineers and enthusiasts. Yet disappearance didn't erase impact. The influence remained, hidden in later decisions and safer machines. The threat was gone from sight, but not from memory. And that unresolved tension would resurface in ways no press release could ever explain. It lingered quietly, shaping choices long after the car itself vanished completely. After the project vanished, its consequences didn't. Inside Chrysler, an invisible line had been drawn. Performance was welcome, but only up to a point. Be fast, be loud, be competitive, just never threaten the crown. That rule quietly shaped every decision that followed. Future Dodge performance cars carried aggression without escalation. Power was impressive, but never positioned as domination. Comparisons were softened. Messaging was careful. The lesson was clear. Crossing that line created more risk than reward. The Chevrolet Corvette felt that shift, even if no one acknowledged it publicly. Its evolution became more deliberate, more insulated. Improvements arrived, but always framed as progress, not response. The existence of a rival that could have forced radical change was erased before it ever reached the street. That's what makes this Dodge project a ghost competitor. Not a car that lost, but one that was never allowed to compete. Its influence lived on indirectly, shaping what others avoided rather than what they attempted. Across the industry, balance replaced confrontation. Manufacturers learned that upsetting icons carried consequences beyond sales figures. Some victories weren't worth claiming. Some benchmarks were better left untouched. For enthusiasts, that absence created a strange legacy. Respect mixed with frustration. A sense that American performance skipped a chapter it was ready to write. The car didn't fail, it was contained. And in that containment, it changed everything. The Corvette never faced it on the road, but it faced the idea of it forever. A reminder that the most powerful competitors aren't always beaten. Sometimes they're simply never allowed to exist. In silence, its shadow rewrote priorities, limited ambition, and proved that absence can shape history as forcefully as victory, leaving an industry guided not by what happened, but by what almost did, and it was never publicly acknowledged. In the end, this story was never about failure. It was about restraint. The decision made inside Chrysler wasn't driven by what the car couldn't do, but by what it already had. Winning was possible, and that was the problem. Allowing this Dodge to exist without limits would have forced a reckoning. It would have challenged the mythology surrounding the Chevrolet Corvette and exposed how fragile even the strongest icons can be when confronted directly. Preserving balance became more important than rewriting history. So the car was never allowed to prove itself publicly, not because it lacked potential, but because it had too much. In protecting the hierarchy, Chrysler protected stability, relationships, and legacy, but at the cost of innovation's most dangerous form, honest competition. For American performance enthusiasts, that choice left behind an unanswered question. What might the landscape look like if fear hadn't intervened? How many other threats were quietly neutralized before they could change everything? This Dodge remains a reminder that some of the most important cars never reach the road. They exist only in decisions not taken, victories not claimed, and stories never officially told. And that's what makes this one linger. Not the car itself, but the silence around it. A silence that suggests American performance didn't lose, it hesitated. And in that hesitation, something extraordinary was quietly left behind forever.